Allow me to introduce myself.
The Two Dudes Podcast.
Aren't we all? Today we're going to talk about the economic implications of salt trade monopolies in the ancient Mali Empire. Now, if you're like me, this is the first time you've ever even heard of the ancient Mali Empire. Is the same for you, Aiden?
No.
No? Okay. So tell us a little bit about the monopolies of the ancient Mali Empire.
Yeah, so the economic implications of the salt trade monopolies in ancient Mali Empire were significant, influencing both the empire's prosperity and socio-political dynamics. The Mali Empire, which thrived from the 13th to the 16th century in West Africa, controlled key trade routes that linked sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world. Salt, being a highly valued commodity, was integral to the empire's economy and played a central role in its wealth and political stability.
So, just what are your first thoughts on this monopoly of salt trade in the ancient Mali Empire? Because when I think about it, of course, you think about how big businesses have a monopoly over certain consumer items in the economy today, and like you start to think, okay, this is an ancient economy where they have a monopoly in something as big as salt. You know, we got Morton's, we got what's the other salt name? It's like Ivers or something. I don't know.
Pink Himalayan.
Yeah, pink Himalayan salt. You know, you've got like 3 or 4 salt brands
rock
that
salt.
everybody know. Yeah, rock
sea
salt. Yeah, and like the salt that you put in your water softener. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so there's not a true monopoly on salt today, but I wonder if Mali was the whole reason why we don't have a monopoly on the salt industry still today.
Right. So, salt was essential for preserving food mostly back in these days, and its scarcity in the sub-Saharan Africa made it like very valuable, right? So the Mali Empire controlled vast salt deposits, particularly in regions of Takaza and the salt mines of the Sahara Desert, and this gave the empire a monopoly over the salt trade, which, along with gold, became a major driver of economic wealth. By controlling the supply, the empire was able to exert significant economic influence over neighboring regions and across trade routes.
Yeah, well, the thing that I'm seeing that's really intriguing me the most, it's a little bit off what you were saying, but Mali was able to keep the trade routes safe. That's like the number one thing that they talk about, and they promised these merchants safe passage, but everything that they make, Mali would take taxes off of. So they had a monopoly basis basically off of taxes on salt trade. So, if you really think about it, these guys are economical geniuses.
Right. It kind of reminds you of the lithium battery mining that goes on now with like Tesla and Apple. That's kind of what I'm getting a hint of, especially with the trade routes in like Panama, the canal.
Yeah. Like, you obviously got this like giant economic powerhouse in Mali who's controlling the salt trade, but you got to look. I wonder where the small guys were. Like, who was their competition? Because you know there's always those small come-up brands.
Monopoly doesn't have competition. That's what makes it a monopoly.
I know, but sometimes there's a come-up brand that starts a competition, and they buy them out. So, you know, you think about an ancient economy, they probably just killed all them bastards. Like, you really think about it.
True.
If there was an up-and-coming business or up-and-coming salt trader that didn't pay taxes, he probably got public executed. And that has to be a scary world to live in.
Right. Well, we know back in these ancient times there was a lot of sacrificial, routines in especially Egyptian religion. But before we get to the kind of ending of the empire itself, I want to get to revenue generation. I want to talk about how the empire generated substantial revenue from the salt trade by controlling production and distribution of salt. The Mali rulers, specifically Mansa Musa, could tax merchants and traders, boosting the empire's treasury, and they had the ability to extract taxes from this lucrative trade, allowed the Mali Empire to fund its military campaign specifically, and they also built infrastructure and they maintained it in royal court.
So what I'm seeing, though, is in West Africa, it was a huge deal, all this in Mali, and you know how Egypt is the northernmost part of Africa. It's up there towards the top. You wonder how it affected the Egypt empire that they had. I wonder if that affected how they grew, how they forced all this. And then you get into like Romans and stuff like that where, you really wonder how it affected all these other, because I know now Francis Ngannou, who's a famous UFC fighter, he's from that Western Africa area. I'm not exactly sure what region of Western Africa, but he grew up in the salt mines. I watched a whole documentary about it, and they talked about how he grew up in the salt mines, and that's where his power comes from. He's the hardest hitter probably in UFC history, but think about it, there's still giant salt mines. It's still kind of a monarchy today where there's the giant salt mines in Africa that people control.
Right. Well, what we do know about salt mines is they're very brutal. We know that salt in itself, sodium, is just an awful element to have to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. And what do you use salt for? So, like, I feel like that's something we should talk about. Like, what is your favorite way to use salt? You know, that'll be like a little segment. What's your favorite way or favorite thing about this topic? So, what is your favorite thing to do with salt?
Potatoes, all kinds of potatoes, fries, baked, chips.
So you like salt on potatoes? Because like my thing is I love salt on some eggs, you know, and but I get your point, because some mashed potatoes with some salt and pepper on it,
And French fries.
it never misses really.
You can't have a French fry without salt.
No, potatoes and salt, I think, are one of the greatest duos of all time.
Right.
And
It's the starch. It takes out the starch. That's
Yeah.
what you need it for.
yeah, and when you go top duos, you got to have salt and potatoes on there.
You gotta. You know, and people don't usually look at that. They look at potatoes and ketchup, or potatoes and cheese, and really.
And when you're making that top 5 list, if it's not in the top 5, it's got to be an OLI, you know?
Right.
Outside looking in.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because when I think of all-time duos, you think of LeBron and Wade, Jordan and Pippen.
Yep.
An underrated duo is golf and hot dogs. You know, not many people like that duo, but all golfers out there, if anybody golfs that listens to this podcast, they know that hot dog on the bend is the greatest invention of all time.
True. All right. But I think we're really getting away from the salt mines here. That's a good little segment, I think. But let's get back on. You talked about Francis Ngannou and his, strains in the salt mines, and I want to talk a little bit about that, because I don't think people really, understand how awful it really is to work in a salt mine. So, what are your thoughts exactly on working in a salt mine?
Well, like, of course you see, like, that they always are, they just look exhausted. Everybody looks physically exhausted after days in the mine, and it's probably some of the hardest labor on earth, of just working these 12-hour shifts in the salt mine, where you're getting pennies on the dollar, not even that really, and they're just get no food breaks for food or water. They're basically being abused. It's terrible to work in the salt mines like that.
Yeah, so you got to realize a mine is a mine at the end of the day. I think we've known forever that mines are probably the worst working conditions that you can be in. And a lot of reasons go into that. In mines you always have the risk of a collapse, which is one of the biggest things. I've known several people that have been either killed or injured really bad in a coal mine, and that's Southern Illinois where we are. That's very prevalent. But in the salt mines, it's a lot more hot, it's a lot more humid, and there's a lot more dust. The air quality is not good at all in a salt mine, since you're always breathing in, this salt dust. And you got to think, how is it, in a low pressure environment, in a mine, where you're breathing in salt?
That's just not good for your lungs. Many smokers have bad lungs, and these people that are working in the mines might have less.
Right. It usually leads to respiratory problems. I've seen several studies where it says the difference made in a salt mine from people using a mask and not using a mask is like worlds. It's incredible, because salt's such a big, there was this thing in COVID where masks weren't working for, that's what the studies are saying now, but because these micro particles were getting through these masks. But you got to think how big a piece of salt is, and how big that is coming off you're drilling into a wall of sodium, and you got to think that's probably getting stopped by a layer of fabric.
Yeah, and it's insane to me, the condition of these salt mines, again, when you think about it, because there's really no circulation when you get that deep into a hole. There's no circulation. Like I do a little bit of blue collar on the side, and you'll get in these spots where you just don't have circulation. And sometimes when there's fiberglass in the air, like I'll wear a mask when I'm doing stuff like that, but you can just see it sitting. It doesn't move because there's no circulation in the attics or the crawl spaces that I'm in. And you think that's like, holy crap. Like you sometimes just sit there and think like I could be in so much worse of a position. And when we're talking about this, like that's what you think about. Salt is just so terrible for these people to breathe in, and it's truly eye opening to see what these people like are going through condition wise and work wise, and you really worry about the health and well being of the poor workers really that are stuck in these salt mines.
Right. And I think another part of the dangers that go into actually mining salt, like one of the big things that you might not think about when you first think of a mine, but explosives. You know, you got to think about chemicals, specifically chemicals, because a lot of explosion injuries don't actually come from the explosion. It comes from building the device to make the explosion. You know, when they extract salt from deep down, they use like big nitrates or chemical byproducts from other mines usually to break apart rock that they're stuck on. And the most common issue that you see with this is chemical burns, you know, in the eyes. That's a lot of, you know, combined with dust and other fine particles when you're mining salt in your eyes with other chemical burns. A lot of these people come out, you know, never being able to see again.
Yeah, chemical burns and stuff like that. It's almost like getting bleach in your eyes, you know, and that's where we're from. And BFE is what most people like to call it in Southern Illinois. It's really just like we're in the middle of nowhere, and if somebody gets bleach in their eye, that's what you think about. And then here in these big mines, it's becomes this whole different game because they're dealing with actual like life changing chemicals. Like you can't even get it on you. So it's again another one where it's crazy. But Aiden, I want to switch back to our original topic. Just like the value that salt had, and then just like how the salt trade monopoly, how that had such bad implications on the Mali economy, and how it almost sunk and tanked the economy because for as big of a mineral, as big of a resource as salt is, you think it can take a whole economy if you have a monopoly over it and somebody has control over that said element, that said mineral. And I think that back in the day, those mines were probably worse. But again, we'll go back to the economy. A lot of the economy was simply just built off of street trade. The market of people putting up shacks on the street. You see it in movies all the time, which is about as well as I'm informed about ancient Egypt. But you go back to that and you think, holy cow, the economy has to have just been driven by this salt trade monopoly, and the people that were running the salt trade are mega millionaires.
Right. Well, I think one of the very, you know, large parts of the actual economic implications, like, you know, when we start talking about politics, the salt was like a super important factor in shaping, you know, specifically political landscape in West Africa. You know, since they dominated the salt trade, the Mali Empire could exert their power over all their neighboring states and tribes. So those who were dependent on the salt trade, you know, for their own survival and economic well-being, this monopoly kind of allowed Mali to expand its influence and maintain its political control as the empire could, you know, withhold access to salt from its rivals.
And something that I just thought about, do you know who was actually alive and a prominent being during this time? Mansa Musa. That's where a lot of he was known as the richest person in history. And you think about it, he probably has thrived off of that salt trade just from the taxation that they put on people, and the fact that he was a conqueror. He went around and conquered empires and spread his wealth. And He had $421 billion at one point in his life. So Mansa Musa, got to put him up there for one of the GOATs of economy and wealth.
Yeah, I mean, when you really think about empires like that, you gotta realize how big of a actual tax they were putting on these other, local states when it came to salt.
Yeah, and I think that we should at some point try to make a top 5 list by the end of this podcast, and we'll make a little list and we'll compare them. But while we're going, Aiden, I think we'll make a list of top 5 conquerors of all time. Top 5 just ancient conquerors of all time, and we'll see how our lists compare.
Right. Well, let me tell you a little bit more about Mansa Musa. So he was the king of the Mali Empire, right? That's kind of how we got into this. He's considered one of the wealthiest individuals in history, as you mentioned. But it wasn't just due to salt; it was due to gold also. And his key thing was trading, specifically with the Mali Empire.
Yes, and that gold trade, I actually forgot to bring up how important the gold was. They said that he carried around so many gold bars, and for as rare of a resource as it was back in the day, and you think about it, that gold was worth so much more than it is now. And he was trading it for so much salt and money.
Right. Well, I really like to, speaking of other powerful emperors, I want to talk about how he kind of reminds me of Julius Caesar. Mansa Musa's wealth was rooted in Mali, right? While Julius Caesar's power stemmed from military victories, where Mansa Musa didn't have, necessarily as big of a military impact as Julius Caesar did, but they were both very strong, transformative leaders. Caesar expanded Roman territory, revolutionized Roman governments, and left a lasting legacy, while Mansa Musa elevated Mali to its peak, becoming a symbol of prosperity and cultural flourishing in West Africa. The cultural impact was major for both ends, Julius Caesar and Mansa Musa. And, the development of the regions in general is probably the most mind-blowing part. Caesar's regions, they reformed, changed Roman law, governance, while Mansa Musa's support of Islam and other cultural institutions like schools and mosques helped shape the intellectual and religious life of Mali and West Africa. And, they were both very famous leaders. Julius Caesar's actions, their reforms are key to the rise of the Roman Empire, and his life has been studied extensively, similarly as Mansa Musa's life. They're both legendary. Wealth and pilgrimage to the Mecca have gave him, a significant figure in the history of Africa. And they always had indirect connections, like their trade routes often kind of crossed with each other, and the Islamic influence was pretty huge on both sides.
Yeah, and the Roman Empire, I think we'll have to devote a whole episode to the Roman Empire itself.
Yes.
Later down the line, it'll be, 2 guys talking about the Roman Empire. Who doesn't love the Roman Empire? But Caesar especially, you think about how rich of a man he was, how powerful he was, and Julius Caesar was actually murdered by his own Senate. That's something that we learn about very quick, that his Senate didn't like the way he ruled the Roman Empire, and they killed him. And then they took over, and they actually had the first democracy, true democracy in history. And you see how important that was just heading forward into history today as America's democracy. All these countries, all these nations are democracies in the world right now, and it makes you wonder, just like, wow, we have so many pulls from these ancient empires, these ancient civilizations that they have influenced America and just the world in general so much. But Julius Caesar, he could be another episode on his own, just the life of Julius Caesar. But you really just have to look at the social and economic standpoint of the world at that time. As economically, it was driven by salt trade. It was driven by a lot of farming. Farming was really just the social, not social, it was just the cornerstone of the economy back in the Roman Empire, all those empires before that, and how it's still important today, but it's not the cornerstone of the economy. But like farmers were some of the richest people that had chickens, people that had just like wheat fields, cornfields, all that. It was so important back in the day because farming was about the only thing that you could do outside of salt trade and like mining trade. And then, of course, you had the slaves back then that had to work and build all this stuff, build all of like the Colosseum and all that, but they weren't getting paid, of course. So the farming world was so important back then, and Julius Caesar, I think, was another one where he had such a big play in making farming so important in the economy.
Right. I mean, he really did have a huge impact on farming, but something that you kind of hit on earlier that I want to go back on a little bit is, the type of government. You talked about Julius Caesar and how the fall of Julius Caesar came with the rise of the first democracy. And I want to talk about how Mansa Musa ran an absolute monarch, which, basically means he's the king. It's essentially the same as a dictatorship, which, that means he held complete authority over military, political empires, and social affairs, that kind of entire world of government. And his administration was like super organized with a clear hierarchy. That's kind of how Mansa Musa worked. He had advisors, military commanders, officials who helped him govern the vast territories of the Mali Empire. His capital city, Timbuktu, became a major center of administration, culture, and trade.
But so we'll just talk about this, and we'll go to the list that we were talking about of our top 5 conquerors of all time. Aiden, have you started on your list? Have you made it so far?
My top 5 conquerors. No, I have not. I want to get Julius Caesar in there, obviously, but I'm not sure who.
Well, we'll start off with number 5. I'll bring up my number 5. We'll see if you agree.
Okay.
Number 5, I have Napoleon. I think you got to throw Napoleon in there, of course, because of the memes that changed the world back in, I think, like 2023, maybe late 22. But he would be higher on my list. He didn't conquer quite enough, but he had a great run when he was conquering all that ground and what was a giant part of the French Empire that we know today. And he would be higher also if he wasn't 5'3".
Right. Literally, he would be higher.
Yeah, he would be literally higher, and he would be higher on the list if he wasn't so short. He had little hands, little everything, and you see all the time just how small of a human being he was.
Right.
No, go ahead.
You want to talk about a little bit about, his downfall?
I think downfall of Napoleon will be another episode. I think we'll get a little, at some point we're going to get this little timeline orchestrated out, and we'll give you guys a hint at what we're going to be talking about a couple episodes into the future and what we're going to continue to do with this show, the Two Guys podcast, where we talk about stuff that's way past how smart we are. So you're going to learn with us as we research random topics as we give you the podcast. They might get a little bit more lighthearted as we go. We're still not sure about the delivery since this is episode number 1, but I'll go with number 4. That's Mansa Musa. Didn't conquer much, but he had a crap ton of money. When you got $421 billion, you had to conquer a little bit, but he didn't have near as much land as these other guys. Number 3, we'll see if you agree with this one, Caesar.
Caesar, obviously.
Yeah.
Very.
Caesar at 3, I think, is a great spot for him because these top 2 guys that's all they're known for, is being a conqueror, being a leader, and how they grew their country and their land. And we will see just how important it is that these guys really built up their empires, and some of them even the way they fell. But are you ready for the top 2?
Yes.
At number 2, I really need your opinion on this one. At number 2, I had to put Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great, what a great pick.
Yeah, Alexander the Great at 2, I think was a lot better than putting him at the 1 spot, because I think everybody's going to guess who the 1 spot is once it gets to time. But Alexander the Great, known for conquering. He extended the Roman Empire. Thought it was the Roman Empire, right?
Alexander the Great, yeah.
Yeah. He extended the Roman Empire almost to all of Italy, and I think he got into some of Greece. So, just so amazing how much he grew that empire, how much he grew Italy. He grew into Greece. He even got, I think, up all the way close to Turkey, but I could be wrong. That whole Mediterranean Sea was just such a giant part, and I don't know if they got all the way into Turkey, but I could be wrong.
They got all the way to India.
Yes,
They
he
went
got
from Greece to Egypt to India, brought that entire Macedon, ancient Greek kingdom all the way out there.
Yeah, so he grew his country, he grew what he had to do, and you can't leave him off your list, but he sure can't be out of the top 3. And then at number 1, I think you can guess it, Aiden. I'll give you one shot at it.
Who would you pick?
I feel like it's the only guy I haven't mentioned. He's still got bloodline to this day.
Oh.
Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan.
He's 1 out of every 200 people is related to Genghis Khan, if you didn't know that. So
I knew that.
He is such a big part of the world today, and he had such a giant empire. The Mongolian Empire stretched all the way to Greece. It battled Greece, and that's part of the downfall, is its wars in the western part of the world as he stretched his empire all the way from, I think Mongolia is right near China. It's in that China-Japan range, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know he gotten close to Japan, but he never went over to Japan because it was so hard for him to battle on water, and Japan was its own thing. So we'll probably do an episode 2 about just ancient Japanese culture and how it still affects the world today, because people love samurais, and I would love to talk about samurais.
Right.
But again, his downfall, though, we can't leave that out of this episode, and we'll do an episode about just Genghis Khan, is the fact that he overextended. He stretched himself so thin trying to get into the Western Hemisphere that he was the downfall of his own militia.
All right, well, do we want to get into my list now?
Yes, I would love to hear your list, and
All right.
I'll give a couple thoughts.
I got a super hot take list because, I really don't like emperors. That's just kind of how it is. So, you can kind of opinionate whatever you want about an emperor, specifically, their politics, religion, stuff like that. It's all kind of an objective kind of view on it. So, really, first, number 5, we got Karcher, the forgotten emperor who should have changed everything. Karcher, the emperor who ruled for about 5 minutes, had the potential to be Rome's greatest leader, right? But the universe had other plans, obviously. This guy came in during a time of military crisis and was poised to actually reform the empire, balancing military and political power better than anyone in the 3rd century. Instead, he just drops dead during a campaign like a sucker. If he had lived, maybe Rome would have avoided the unprecedented decline in the following decades. Karcher was an unsung hero of the late empire, a man ahead of his time who never got a chance to prove it.
I think him at 5 is a little bit of a stretch. You really said hot take. He might be on the outside looking in, but I'm going to hate to see who you left off to put the man who ruled for, 5 minutes?
5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 minutes, and I put him on the list.
Yeah, well, that's kind of just how my list is going to go, unfortunately. There's a lot of great, famous leaders, but, there's also a lot of, funny history.
Yeah, and unsung heroes, I guess you could say.
Heroes, yeah. So next we got Commodus, the only emperor who knew how to keep Rome entertained. All right, we got Commodus was actually a true entertainer and understood the essence of Roman culture better than most of his predecessors. Forget the gladiatorial bloodbath. Commodus knew that the spectacle was the lifeblood of Rome. He wasn't a terrible emperor, just, incredibly out of touch. Rome was all about power, theater, domination, and he leaned into the absurdity of it. Imagine if social media existed back then. Commodus would have been a viral sensation. Rome needed a little chaos, and he provided it. Let's be honest, Rome was probably better with him on the throne than some of those boring, straight-laced emperors who followed the rules.
And the cool thing about Commodus is I think they portrayed a little bit, in the new Gladiator movie, Gladiator 2, there were 2 dual emperors that were brothers, and I think that they pulled a little bit of inspiration from how Commodus ruled to create those two empires.
Right. Well, he was super sporadic. You know, he kind of reminds you of Donald Trump now because his social media impact. You know, I kind of mentioned that. It's just the way that certain rulers will come in and just be, they won't follow the rules.
You never know what he's gonna say.
You never know what he's gonna say. That's a huge factor. All right, but at 3 we got Hadrian, the emperor who is a hardcore architect. Hadrian's obsession with architecture and the building of Hadrian's Wall is what kept him in power. He was an emperor who cared more about his personal legacy and buildings, than actual governments. His reign is super overhyped, I think so. He's just the emperor version of someone who makes their Instagram feed all about their vacation photos instead of doing the work. The empire may have benefited from some of his projects, but his obsession with the walls, literally and metaphorically, limited the empire's potential. But I have to put him at 3 over the other 2 because his government actually did have quite a few, big wins, but he was mostly a pretty conceited, self-centered emperor.
In your list, you're going with emperors. That's what I'm just noticing. You aren't doing true conquerors like Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great. I'm kind of enjoying hearing the way that you're talking more just about empires, but Aiden, we're going to need you to,
speed it up.
Speed off these next 2, just because we're nearing the end of the episode. We're going to want to tell them a little bit about our future topics.
All right, well, we got Nero, right, number 2. He's not a madman, just a product of his time. Nero gets a bad rap. He was the monster, history paints him as. Maybe he was the first truly modern emperor. Sure, he had a penchant for extravagance, and his artistic side get the best of him, but it's possible he was more of a misunderstood artist and a bloodthirsty tyrant. That whole burning the Rome thing, more likely a scapegoat for elites who hated him. But, that's number 2. And then at number 1, Augustus, the manipulative genius who ruined Rome forever. Augustus was the worst thing that ever happened to the Roman Republic. He had peace and stability, but it was all a sham. He clearly turned Rome from a republic to an empire, securing power for himself while pretending to uphold republican values. Augustus didn't save Rome. He just played the longest con in history and laid the groundwork for centuries of autocratic rule. His Pax Romana were like Pax Augustus, a reign built on the backs of political manipulation and the gradual erosion of freedom.
So that'll be our final thing of the day. We're going to tell you about 3 or 4 upcoming topics. I'll just round them off real quick. The corruption of the Catholic Church is going to be one that we bring up a little bit. It's also going to be, we're going to talk about
another monarch.
Yeah, talk about the Pope. Then we're going to talk about Napoleon Dynamite's reign. We're going to talk about the Roman Empire. Then the final thing we're going to talk about is the Mongolian Empire, Genghis Khan. Those are just 4 things that we're going to talk about later. And we're only going to do 5 episodes for what we're going to call Season 1 of the Two Guys podcast. Or Two Dudes podcast, sorry. But thank you again for listening. It's been Max and Aiden, the 2 dudes.
1 mic.
Have a good one.
Baby girl. Baby girl, let me see you do your dance, let me see you twirl. Shake an ass in the club with your homegirls.